Ever wonder what it really takes to make zero trust work in practice? Welcome to Zero Trust Journey, the podcast that cuts through the noise and dives into real stories and strategies to bring zero trust to life. The cybersecurity world is flooded with buzzwords and vendor hype, but here we focus on what truly matters, practical insights and lessons from those who've walked the path. Each episode is inspired by real experiences, grounded in our research, and enriched by the challenges and triumphs of our guests. If you're ready to grow your skills, deepen your insights, and take actionable steps toward a stronger zero trust strategy, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. The views and opinions expressed on the Zero Trust Journey podcast, webcast are solely those of the participants and do not represent the views of their employers or affiliated organizations. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only. Neither the employers nor any sponsors are liable for actions taken based on the content discussed.
Welcome to another session of Zero Trust Journey. My name is Victor Monga. With me today in studio, I have Snehal Antani. Snehal is co-founder of Horizon 3.ai, and it's a platform that I really admire because I come from the continuous security validation background. Snehal, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Appreciate being here.
So let's jump right into it. You have worked in Fortune 500 companies, you worked at DoD as well, and now you have your own startup. You've operated in a wide range of environments, from high-stakes government roles to leading tech companies, each likely influencing some of your perspective on risk and zero trust. Can you walk us through, and our listeners, your career journey and share what key experiences really influence on cybersecurity and zero trust?
Yeah, sure thing. So I started my career as a software engineer at IBM. I focused on distributed systems. In particular, I was a developer on the WebSphere platform, covering both mainframes and distributed systems. It was really interesting starting off in middleware in my enterprise kind of software development career, was you had to understand the app layer, you had to understand the virtualization layer, and you had to understand the hardware layer to some degree. And so I kind of started in the middle of the stack, and it did a great job giving me exposure to everything above me, below me, to my left and to my right. And so it's just a great way to kind of get professional experience with kind of breadth and depth. And then after that, I became a customer of the technology I helped build by becoming a CIO at GE Capital. And what was great there was, it's one thing to build technology, it's another to actually apply it to business problems. So I got to really learn the challenges of adopting new technology, operationalizing it, actually delivering business impact and outcome, and then securing, operating, and defending it as well, because I didn't really have that challenge or burden previously. And then moved out to Splunk and did some really interesting things as a CTO of Splunk. But then joined DoD, and that's where I really got to understand the complexity of securing, operating, and defending critical systems and critical networks. And I think the collection of those experiences underpinned the thesis I formed around Horizon 3, which is, I have no idea I'm secure until the bad guys show up. For every patch Tuesday, I want to pen test Wednesday, and I want to pen test my environment as often as my environment changes. And so how do I continuously find, fix, and verify?
And we'll talk more about doing the show as well, where a lot of times it's a lot of CISOs or strategic leaders, they ask, what's the right number of frequency? How many times do I run the test? Or how long do I run the test? Or which part of the environment should I run the test? And we'll talk more about it. I want to double click on the part where your time at Splunk in your previous position. It's a major data analyst company. You were at the forefront of that and the security solution. So founding your own venture where you have strong drive to address security challenges, and it's a lot to do with continuous security testing and automation, exactly what we're talking about. How did your experience at Splunk really focused and influenced the way you approach automated security testing and continuous security validation in the context of data privacy and data security?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, the really big push and kind of thesis we had at Splunk in early 2015 when I joined as CTO is that there's a significant overlap between observability data for IT and data for cybersecurity. In fact, at the time, I think there was a 60 or 70% overlap in the data sources for both of those outcomes. Yet the data tend to be stovepiped in different siloed solutions. And so at Splunk, we're able to enable different people to ask different questions of the same data. IT operations folks for troubleshooting and resilience, cybersecurity folks for SOC alert, detection and response. And then actually on the business analytics side as well, because your machine data is telling you a story, whether a server crashed and an end user is upset, or the end user had a bad user experience and is about to complain. Like, that digital exhaust actually underpins cybersecurity data, IT operations outcomes, and business analytics outcomes. And I think Splunk was the first true enterprise platform that enabled IT security and business analytics capabilities. And we won the market in that regard. The other thing I really learned at Splunk was actually less on the technical side and much more on how to scale go to market. Those lessons really underpin philosophies we applied at Horizon 3. The importance of channel partners and channel sales, the importance of simplistic pricing and packaging, the pros and cons of usage-based pricing and other things like that, which were incredibly helpful in learning how to do that at Splunk so I could apply those lessons learned at Horizon 3.
Last time we met at LA when you were keynote speaker, we chatted about this very briefly, Zero Trust. It's branded as a buzzword, and yet it's fundamentally about assuming no user or system has any those inherent trustworthy, or they don't get access to directly without going through the paths. In your words, Snehal, what is Zero Trust? And do you see it crucial to the cybersecurity?
So there's so much marketing hype that clouds and confuses people on what Zero Trust is. So I keep it super simple. How do we make sure that the end user has access to the right resources from the right device at the right time for the duration they actually need it? It's as simple as that. If I don't need access to Crown Jewels data all the time, cool. Give me just-in-time access. Not from a random personal device, but from a device that I would expect to be accessing it from and so on. So I really think about it as this convergence of mature identity and access management, fine-grained access control that's part of that, with the right network segmentation componentry that's in place, with the right understanding of device and user behavior. And you can combine those together and call it Zero Trust. You can combine those together and just call it a really mature enterprise operating environment that you can secure and so on. But I really think about it as your convergence of identity and access management, segmentation, and these other pieces I talked about earlier.
Yeah, and those are the key principles when it comes to Zero Trust. I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it is fundamental security. It's least privilege, defense and depth, and all those principles that we talked about. I think Zero Trust brings them all together nicely, gives you a little bit of kind of roadmap, and helps you really envision and maturity of your security program. I think in my way, that's what Zero Trust does for you. There's nothing new. It's not teaching you anything new that we haven't talked about it. It's just those silo conversations. It's just bringing it together now for the security maturity.
Yep. I think the acronym I use is YAC, yet another analyst category. And so every couple of years, analysts have to come up with a new category, build their people more subscriptions, and Zero Trust, great category. There's always a new one. CTEM's another one coming out now and whatnot. So hey, people got to make money somehow in the ecosystem, and that's just one way to do it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I think that there's a lot in the marketing hype and all, and I think there are people who are really using and adopting this, and this gave them the springboard to actually explain cybersecurity maturity in a simple term at the board level, at the executive level, so that they're not getting into technology. Speaking of technology, last time when we were recording with Nami, and we talked about well, you mentioned that one of your hardest job at GE was to figure out what not to fix. And that was something most important. So many organizations focus strictly on technology when it comes to it. When it comes to cybersecurity or digital security, they only focus on technology and overlooking culture, processes, the critical aspect of ongoing validation. In your experience that you speak with your partners, customers, prospects, what are the biggest misconceptions when it comes companies are saying that we have implemented, and I'm doing air quotes, we have implemented Zero Trust?
So I was actually going to answer a slightly different question. So let me go that way first and come back to Zero Trust. So the hardest part of my job as a CIO was deciding what not to fix. And let's just double click on that comment for a moment. So what I meant by that was just because I was vulnerable to a problem didn't mean I was exploitable. And I'll tie this back to Zero Trust in a moment. So for example, take Log4Shell. Just because I have a vulnerable Log4j jar file doesn't mean the attacker is going to be able to inject a malicious JNDI command and trigger the outbound call and gain access to get code execution on the host or whatever. Because I could have put some network egress controls in place that prevented the outbound RMI call from occurring. And so I might have the vulnerable jar file, but I've put in some mitigating controls that prevented exploitation. And a scanner, a vuln scanner or whatever, doesn't understand that. They don't actually do the exploitation. They're just looking for whether the jar file exists or not, and I've got to go chase my tail trying to fix it. And so if you're a large bank, or in my case, I think I was at DoD at the time, we would have thousands or tens of thousands of instances of this jar file. And do I really need to make my team work nights and weekends to update them all? Or can I just fix one network egress rule, no longer make it exploitable, and then solve it on the next deploy or something like that? And so the really important distinction was vulnerable versus exploitable. Now, where zero trust is important is zero trust adds in a whole bunch of additional options or knobs and levers for mitigating controls. So just because I've got a vulnerable server, if I'm able to isolate it within a segment and prevent that compromised host from laterally maneuvering into crown jewels data or other important things, is it as critical? Or do I have to skip dinner with the family or a vacation or my kid's basketball game to fix it? Or can I fix it at normal hours tomorrow or next week? I think zero trust in that context of vulnerable versus exploitable is the additional levels of mitigating controls that it creates to minimize the blast radius of a breach. I think that is really important for any organization, is understanding your exploitable attack surface, understanding the blast radius of a particular initial access point for compromise, and then using that to decide how urgent it is to fix that problem.
This ties back to what you talked about during your keynote, attack surface versus protect surface. And understanding that differences, understanding what I need to do. Is it attack surface? That's vulnerability management, telling me what's wrong. Protect surface, is it exploitable? Can I fix it quickly and go home and run the mitigation steps and all that tomorrow? Exactly what you're saying. So.
Yeah, I remember when I was at GE Capital, I think like 2013 or 2014, Heartbleed had hit. And I remember watching the team, GE Capital Corporate, so the kind of the parent organization, running this incredibly intense war room.
Yeah.
Trying to understand whether their Heartbleed, like, well, who was exploiting Heartbleed, how quickly were we patching, so on and so forth. I remember watching the entire IT team mobilize to go patch and fix this particular thing. But no one really asked, okay, what's the impact? Is it truly exploitable? Just because we've got the vulnerability there, what can actually happen? And because no one really understood what the impact was, because it was really hard to do so then, we burned 50, 60% of the IT team's capacity globally patching this thing. That meant that those people were not working on business problems that drove revenue or customer happiness or customer success. So, the hardest part of my job is deciding what not to fix also includes a prioritization problem. How do I prioritize my tasks and activities to maximize impact on the business? And that could be fixing something exploitable. It could be mitigating controls so I can deliver a revenue generating capability. And until you actually understand your exploitable attack surface, you are prioritizing in the blind.
Totally, 100%. Speaking of prioritization, when it comes to zero trust, it can be seen as daunting. And in the words of John Kinderberg, it's not a complex problem, it's hard. And organizations tend to run away from the hard problems because just putting a blinky box doesn't fix it, especially if they lack any clear roadmap. So what practical advice is of things you have seen where security leaders can actually take it to, or just starting the journey and maturing it?
Yeah. The key word of what you just said is journey. One of the biggest frustrations as zero trust started to hit that hype cycle peak were the number of CIOs in my network and CISOs in my network that thought zero trust was a product or a vendor, right? It's not. It is an evolution of your existing security capabilities. It is an evolution of your processes, and it's an evolution of your people and your reporting. And it is an evolution in all three of those areas that have to synchronize at key points in order to achieve this outcome of minimizing the blast radius of a compromise. Because at the end of the day, that's the goal or the intent of a zero trust program, is to reduce the blast radius of compromise. And as long as you take that as the outcome, it doesn't matter if you use like a CNAPP solution or a SASE or whatever, all the other acronyms that came out of the last few years, just minimize the blast radius through a variety of good security hygiene and practices and discipline, and you're making progress.
100%. I think that also goes with where implementing zero trust requires a cultural shift. For especially with organizations, they have been given root and admin access, and shared logins are used, and application access are not controlled properly. It can be seen daunting, again, going back to the analogy where when you're starting zero trust or starting any security maturity, these things are going to come up. How do you think CISOs, CIOs, or your peers, they can overcome that cultural shift? How can they actually really evangelize zero trust among their organization and help people understand this is a good thing for organization if we do it this way, so that we don't have to actually trust the endpoint. We don't have to trust the endpoint. And it has nothing to do with the personal trust that humans have. It's a trust with the packets that transmitting from computers. And that's the advice I want to hear from you.
Yeah, so you mentioned endpoint. I think that's not necessarily the right path to start with, because you would immediately restrict the problem to just one piece of it. If you go back to how do you reduce the blast radius of a compromise, and then simplify that even further to the word reachability. How do I reduce network reachability of anything on my network? How do I reduce credential reachability of any user in my network? And how do I reduce device reachability of any individual device on my network? Just start with the term reachability. Now let's double click on that. Well, how do you reduce network reachability? Well, if you have a big, flat, open network, you're kind of in a bad spot because the network reachability is massive. Okay, well, how do I reduce that? Is there a reason why people in customer support need to access our training data for AI workloads? Let's just, something. The answer is no. Okay. Well, why does that department need network reachability to our crown jewels training data or our crown jewels financial data or something else? Good question. How do we restrict the reachability of that particular department? I picked customer success and support because, at least in my time as a CIO, that organization tended to have the least people with the worst scores on security training with the highest attrition, right? So you're going to have the highest probability of somebody clicking on something malicious or the highest probability of insider threat from that particular organization. Okay, well, how do I isolate the reachability of that particular team at the network level? Okay, now how do I understand who the users are of that team? And how do I reduce the reachability of their credentials? Do they have reused passwords? Do they have too many permissions? So on and so forth. All right, now let's reduce credential reachability. And then finally, let's reduce device reachability. Should their personal devices be allowed on the network, like your cell phone connects to your corporate network, your personal phone? Well, they're going to want to have their cell phones in the office. They're probably just going to use their cell network, but they do, then let's at least stand up a separate guest network that's open and completely segmented from the corporate network, because otherwise you're going to have bad behavior. And so what I think about is what we just did is took a very complicated problem, broke it down to a very simple term, reachability, and then initially focused on the segment of the workforce most likely to be involved in a breach. And just start there and methodically reduce the reachability of that high-risk workforce across those dimensions, and you've started the journey. Now work out to the next one, and the next population, and the next population, and then you're making progress.
I think that's key. When it comes to, especially when you're starting new or starting evolving your security program, I think breaking it down to really bite size is important, because otherwise it's, if you walk into a large enterprise and ask them, hey, do you have a mapping of every department, what applications do they need to access, and every person what they need to access, it's not something they have it handy dandy, then they can put it up. But if you ask them, here are your crown jewels, you know who they need to access by, and here are my most critical departments that I need to be worried about. Now you have something to start with, as you said in your example.
Exactly right. And it's very easy to become overwhelmed. I mean, IT folks, IT operations, network engineers, especially the senior ones, are already overworked. They're already sacrificing family time. They wish they could go home early on a Friday or not worry about being called in over Christmas break. That's just not how it is. And so to pile on a buzzword with a whole bunch of new vendors you've got to go buy and self-integrate is not making their lives easier. And I feel the tagline for Zero Trust really should have been go home early. Because if you do it right, you're, as the senior IT admins, you're going to go home early. Well, what's the pragmatic journey to get there? Once again, I think you start with high risk populations within an enterprise, and then crown jewels data and systems as the other side, and then you'll eventually meet in the middle.
Yep, I like that. High risk population and the high probability what can be exploited, and then just try to keep crunching from there. So let's switch gears. Actually, you must hear this a lot, where companies go through audits, obviously, for compliance reasons, but they also sometimes do audit to validate if they are secure or their security maturity or where they stand. One-time spot audits, or in my world, 2 decades ago, penetration testing, red teaming, and all that, they're not scalable. And one of the key areas of zero trust is that continuous security validation, continuous verification. What suggestions, strategies you recommend to our listeners where they can implement as part of their zero trust journey, where they're continuous verification of the security controls they've applied and check if it's being actually effective or not? That's the biggest thing. Just because I bought the fanciest blinky box, is it effective in my environment? That's the biggest question asked by a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, let's take that a step further, maybe make a little more personal. If I were a CIO again today or a CISO again today, what are the first few chess moves I'd execute in securing, operating, and defending my network, right? Regardless of what zero trust maturity I'm at, hopefully I've got something, but let's assume that you start with nothing. So the first step I would do is understand where are the bodies buried. Like, I'm coming in, I am now liable for a breach the moment I start that morning, Monday morning at whatever, bank or insurance company or so on and so forth. If I get breached that day, it's me on the line being hauled in front of the SEC and the auditor and other people that are out there. So I immediately want to understand, what is my exploitable attack surface? The first thing I would want to do is run a pen test against my entire network, not a sample size, because attackers don't care about your sample size. They view your environment as one interconnected, integrated system. Your cloud environment, your work from home VPN, your SaaS services, your on-prem infrastructure, your critical suppliers. You are one interconnected system in the eyes of the attacker, and you need to understand your exploitable attack surface as one interconnected system. So the first thing I do is run a pen test against my entire infrastructure. Scope is 100% of all assets, IPs in my environment. And then from there, I'm going to understand what were those critical impacts that were achieved. Could the attacker from that initial access point become domain admin, access sensitive data, so on and so forth? And I need to go off and understand that. And then fiercely prioritize reducing those critical impacts that were possible. The third step I would go off and do is, okay, I understand these critical impacts. I've got this remediation effort under place. What did my SOC see? How good were we at detecting and responding to that full scope pen test? Did they log on the commands? Did they log, detect, alert, stop, or stifle in any way? And now what we're going to find is the mean time to reaction of my SOC. So now I've got a baseline. I know where the bodies are buried. I'm chipping away at all the things that are going to put me in the news. And I'm understanding the reaction time of my SOC, which is critical or a big part of my budget. From there, it's, okay, what do I put in place? How do I use that to underpin a security by design program? So the first area of that program is going to be, how do I reduce reachability? How do I better defend my crown jewels data? How do I improve my mean time to remediation? And how do I improve my mean time to detection? Those are the 4 things I'm going to report on to the board every single quarter. And that's what I'm going to focus on. That's also, by the way, the typical playbook of a CISO that's just been breached. Because the window of time where you have an unlimited security budget to some degree is when they've hired in a new CISO, or you've just been breached. Those are kind of the 2 things. And that's the way I would think about it. And I would methodically improve. So that's going to be fun. I'll pause there. Any thoughts or questions? And there's another more advanced thing I would go off and add around reachability. But does that make sense? Does that align with the way you think about it?
Yeah, it does. And keep going. I think that these are good insights so that our listeners would actually take it to their organizations as well.
So the next part of reachability is, the first question is, well, where do you start in understanding your exploitable attack surface? Where I would start is the point with the greatest network reachability, the greatest access. Usually it's your DMZ. From the DMZ, you can access everything. Okay, let's go see what happens. But if a burglar breaks into your kitchen, can they get to the bedroom with the safe and the jewelry? Yes or no? Okay, you want to go understand that. What if they broke into your garage? Could they get to the safe? Okay, that's a different perspective. What if they broke into your basement? Could they get to the safe? So you want to understand your exploitable attack surface from different points of view or different perspectives. And you want those perspectives to align with some basic level of threat modeling that you've done around your organization. Where are the likely initial access vectors or access points in your company? Because you have to assume the bad guy's going to gain initial access. SolarWinds, they accessed the management zone, right? At Caesars, I think they accessed the user zone. And then they were able to maneuver into adjacent zones because of reachability issues and so on. So you want to understand the different perspectives to test from. You want to align those perspectives to an initial cursory threat model that you're worried about. And you want to understand the blast radius of a breach from each of those perspectives and build a get well plan from each of those perspectives. And then the final bit is you want to report on the reduction of your attack surface over time. Back to how many problems did you find? How quickly did you fix them? How often did they reoccur and why? And how effective were you at detection and response? That I mentioned earlier, those are the 4 questions I'm describing to the board every quarter. And then here are the efforts that we put in place to continue to improve metrics across those dimensions.
And Snehal, I think that's a great advice. One thing, let's double click on that one, is resources. I'm sure you hear that a lot as well. When, as a CISO, CIO, I'm sure that's the same challenge you have, where great ideas, great conversation, but at the end of the day, how do we execute it? Resources, money, and people. Let's talk about that. When in Zero Trust journey, in Zero Trust principles, we talk about continuous validation, security validation. When it comes to resources for that one thing, do CISOs need a lot of budget, or do CISOs need a lot of manpower to actually do it at scale? Or are there ways to actually think about these things to cost-effective ways to manage it?
It's a great question. The most important, I talk about the hardest part of the job was deciding what not to do or what not to fix. What that really breaks down to is a single metric that matters the most in security, which is return on effort. It's not even return on investment, because you can't clearly articulate an ROI of a security program. Here's how many breaches we think we stopped, but you don't really know that you stopped them or that they were really breaches. So you kind of think about return on effort. Where can I apply the least amount of effort to reduce the most amount of risk? And you need to understand return on effort and fiercely prioritize on maximizing ROE. Now, buying and deploying a bunch of tools checks a lot of boxes, kind of looks good on your resume, but did you really reduce risk? Did you really maximize return on effort? And the answer is probably not. Just because you installed an EDR doesn't mean that the EDR is tuned correctly to prevent OS credential dumping. Just because you configured a network segment doesn't mean that the attacker can't laterally move through credential reuse or other mechanisms that are in place. And so it goes back to, you want to fiercely prioritize remediation efforts or mitigation efforts and detection efforts and so on that give you the most amount of bang for the least amount of calories put in. So for instance, Horizon 3 customers, they will run a Node Zero pen test, and then we'll tell them, if you fix these weaknesses, you will shut down 80% of the exploitable attack paths we found. So go prioritize these few things, because you're going to apply the least amount of calories and get the maximal amount of risk reduction. And then you're going to go fix them. You're going to run a retest. You're going to verify that, yep, all these critical attack paths, exploitable attack paths that led to domain compromise are no longer possible because you fixed that one SMB not signed a weakness that was in your environment. So that's just one example, but return on effort is important, and that doesn't mean you're deploying a bunch of new tools. It's clearly understanding your exploitable attack surface, which weaknesses enable the most attack paths, and fiercely prioritizing fixing those as quickly as possible.
So as we are coming to wrap of this episode, we do want to hear the story, why Node Zero? Where did that name come from? And how did you decide that that's something you want to have it in your company?
Yeah. So there's two aspects to the name. The first is Horizon 3. So the Horizon 3 name, when I was at GE, we used to do budget planning across 3 cycles. And I guess later I learned that this is how I think like McKinsey or Harvard Business School, somebody uses something similar. Horizon 1 is your current year of execution. Horizon 2 is improving the business next year. And Horizon 3 planning was all about out-year disruption. And so I thought, well, I don't want to call this the cyber jesters or some super cheesy security name like that. And so what I'm really thinking about here is out-year disruption of the cybersecurity industry through AI. So that's why we called it Horizon3.ai. I often joke, I bought .ai because I couldn't afford buying .com back then because the domain name was too expensive. The next part is Node Zero. So in offensive cyber operations and defensive cyber operations within our area of the Department of Defense, we always call the host the attacker gained initial access on as Node Zero or patient zero. And so we said, well, we're going to call it Node Zero because it's always starting from that initial access point in your environment. And so we're going to call the product Node Zero.
I like it. Now we have the story of Horizon 3 and Node Zero. Great. So as we're wrapping up, let's wrap with this one, where if a CISO or security leader wants to drive zero trust adoption in the organization, what practical advice would you give them and tell them, like, here are the 3 things or 5 things or 10 things that Snehal would do if you're starting on your journey of zero trust or you're trying to adopt zero trust?
I think it goes back to some of the things I mentioned earlier. Step 1 is you need to understand where the bodies are buried and where you're going to get the most amount of effort or most amount of risk reduction for the least amount of effort. That is step 1. That is going to help you understand how to start to reduce reachability of your network, of your devices, and of your people. And then as you reduce reachability, you want to continuously verify that you have in fact reduced the blast radius of a particular breach. So you want to start running a pen test, for instance, not just from the kitchen, but from the bedroom, the basement, the garage, and all these other locations, because basically you're segmenting your network into lots of different rooms in your house. You want to understand the blast radius from each room in the house. And so step 1 is where the body's buried. Step 2 is think about what the right floor plan should be for your network based on reachability and blast radius and risk to crown jewels. And then step 3 is continuously report progress based on the metrics I had mentioned earlier.
So thanks so much for being on the show and talking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for tuning in today's Zero Trust Journey. For future shows, please subscribe to ztjourney.com, and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Music, and all other places. Thank you very much for tuning in today.
Thanks for joining us on Zero Trust Journey. If this episode sparked new ideas or gave you practical insights, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your network. Your support helps us continue bringing you valuable conversations and real-world stories. We'd love to hear from you. Share your feedback or even your own zero trust journey by reaching out to us. Your story could inspire others in the community. Stay tuned for more expert insights, compelling stories, and actionable advice to help you advance your zero trust strategy. Until next time, stay curious and keep making progress on your zero trust journey. See you in the next episode.